In the cold void between stars, where civilizations clash and entire species hang in the balance, there exists a universal truth that every advanced race has learned. Compassion is weakness, and weakness leads to extinction. The Zephyrian Empire, masters of 1,000 worlds, built their dominion on this principle. Their military doctrine was simple: show no mercy, spare no enemy, and never, ever allow sentiment to cloud tactical judgment. For 3 centuries, this philosophy had served them well, until they encountered humanity. What the Zephyrians discovered wasn't just another species to conquer, but something that defied every law of survival they understood. Here was a race that would risk everything: their ships, their lives, their very future, to save the children of their enemies. A species that saw cubs, hatchlings, and juveniles not as future threats to be eliminated, but as innocents deserving protection. The Zephyrians called it madness. Their allies called it stupidity. But as the war raged across the galaxy, something unprecedented began to happen. The humans' inexplicable compassion started to crack the foundation of everything the galaxy thought it knew about power, survival, and what it truly means to be strong. This is the story of how one human's act of mercy in the darkest hour of war didn't just save lives. It changed the very nature of an empire and redefined what victory could mean. Commander Thylex Vorn stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Sovereign's Wrath, watching through the massive viewscreen as another human colony burned. The orange flames licked hungrily at the settlement structures, while streams of evacuation pods fled like scattered seeds into the black void of space. His 4 arms remained clasped behind his back, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the bridge's blue lighting as he observed the destruction with cold satisfaction. "Status report," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated the fall of 17 worlds. "The primary settlement is 73% destroyed, Commander," reported his tactical officer, a young Zephyrian whose voice still carried traces of excitement at witnessing such efficient devastation. "Human defensive positions have been neutralized. Estimated casualties: 42,000 military personnel, 160,000 civilians." Thylex nodded approvingly. The numbers were acceptable, well within projections. The humans had fought with their characteristic stubborn determination, but like all the other species the Empire had conquered, they had ultimately fallen to superior firepower and tactical doctrine. What made this particular victory satisfying wasn't just the strategic value of the colony, though its position controlling the Kepler shipping lanes was significant, but the message it sent. Humanity had been growing too bold, too defiant. For months, they had been launching increasingly aggressive counterstrikes against Zephyrian positions, showing a disturbing willingness to sacrifice their own forces to protect weaker species. Just last week, a human fleet had diverted from a crucial supply run to defend a Keltharian refugee convoy, losing 3 ships in the process to save a species that wasn't even their ally. Such irrational behavior needed to be corrected through demonstration. "Sir," the communications officer called out, her antenna twitching with nervous energy. "We're receiving a transmission from the surface. It's a human requesting parley." Thylex's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. "A surrender negotiation? How practical of them. Put it through." The main screen shimmered and resolved into the image of a human male, his face streaked with dirt and blood, wearing the tattered remains of a colonial defense uniform. Behind him, Thylex could see the smoking ruins of what had once been a command center. The human's eyes held that peculiar intensity that Thylex had learned to associate with their species. Neither the calculating coldness of Zephyrian resolve nor the panic of most conquered races, but something altogether different. "I am Colonel Marcus Webb of the New Harmony Defense Force," the human said, his voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion. "I'm requesting an immediate ceasefire to discuss terms." "There are no terms," Thylex replied, allowing a note of condescension to enter his voice. "Your colony has fallen, Colonel. Your resistance is ended. Surrender unconditionally, and your remaining personnel will be processed according to military protocol." The human's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "I understand our military position, Commander, but there are children here. Civilian children who had nothing to do with this conflict. I'm requesting safe passage for evacuation ships carrying non-combatants under the age of 16. This was interesting. Thylex had studied human psychology extensively as part of his preparation for this campaign. Their attachment to their young was notably strong, even by the standards of mammalian species. But what the colonel was requesting went beyond mere parental instinct. He was attempting to leverage military assets for the protection of individuals who would pose no threat for over a decade. Your request is noted and denied, Thylex responded. All human personnel will remain on the surface for processing. Any evacuation ships that launch will be destroyed. The colonel's composure cracked slightly, but he pressed on. Commander, I'm not asking for military personnel or even adult civilians. Just the children. Surely your victory doesn't require. Colonel Webb, Thylex interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority. I will explain something to you that your species seems incapable of understanding. War is not a children's game with arbitrary rules designed to protect feelings. It is the ultimate test of a civilization's fitness to survive. Every human child you seek to protect today will grow to become a human adult tomorrow, an adult who will remember this defeat and seek vengeance against the Empire. Thylex gestured to his tactical display, which showed the orbital positions of his fleet. The Zephyrian Empire has endured for 8 centuries precisely because we understand this fundamental truth. We do not leave seeds of future rebellion scattered behind us. We do not allow sentiment to compromise strategic necessity. And we most certainly do not permit defeated enemies to dictate the terms of their own destruction. The human colonel was silent for several long moments, his face cycling through emotions that Thylex found both fascinating and contemptible. Finally, Webb spoke again, his voice quieter but somehow more intense than before. You're talking about murdering children, Commander. I'm talking about ensuring that this world never again poses a threat to Imperial security, Thylex corrected. The elimination of future enemy combatants is a standard military procedure, one that has served the Empire well in previous campaigns. Your own military manuals acknowledge the principle, though you typically lack the resolve to implement it properly. It was true, and Thylex knew the human was aware of it. He had studied their military history extensively. Humans were perfectly capable of ruthless action when necessity demanded it. They had burned enemy cities, eliminated bloodlines, and committed acts that would be considered brutal even by Zephyrian standards. But they always seemed to struggle with the logical consistency of their own actions, creating arbitrary distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable targets based on emotional rather than strategic considerations. Let me make this perfectly clear, Colonel, Thylex continued, stepping closer to his own visual pickup. In exactly 1 hour, my ground forces will commence final pacification operations. Any human found alive on the surface after that time will be considered a continuing threat to Imperial security. I suggest you use this time to make whatever peace your species makes with death. The transmission ended, and the bridge returned to its normal operational home. Thylex observed his crew as they prepared for the final phase of the operation, noting with approval their professional efficiency. Young Zephyrians sometimes struggled with the necessity of eliminating non-combatants, but proper conditioning and exposure to the realities of interstellar conflict typically corrected such weaknesses. Commander, his tactical officer reported. Ground forces report ready for final sweep. Estimated completion time, 47 minutes. Proceed with pacification, Thylex ordered, and monitor orbital space. If any evacuation ships launch, destroy them immediately. As his crew moved to implement the order, Thylex reflected on the broader implications of today's action. The destruction of New Harmony would send a clear message throughout human space. Continued resistance would result not just in military defeat, but in the complete elimination of human populations. It was a lesson that previous campaigns had taught the Keltharians, the Vorthek, and a dozen other species now living peacefully under Imperial administration. The humans would learn, as all the others had learned, that the universe belonged to those strong enough to claim it and wise enough to hold it. Their peculiar attachment to their young, their irrational willingness to sacrifice tactical advantages for emotional considerations, these are precisely the weaknesses that mark them as unfit for true galactic citizenship. Through the view screen, Thylex watched the last few evacuation pods fleeing the burning colony. His gunners were already calculating firing solutions, preparing to eliminate them the moment they cleared the gravity well. It would be efficient, decisive, and thoroughly in keeping with Imperial doctrine. Down on the planet's surface, his ground forces were beginning their systematic advance through the civilian sectors. The operation would be completed within the hour, and the Kepler system will be fully under Imperial control. The strategic benefits were clear: complete access to the shipping lanes, a forward base for operations against the human core worlds, and a demonstration of Imperial resolve that would discourage further resistance. Yet as Thylex watched the flames spread across the colony's residential districts, he found himself thinking about the human colonel's words. Not because they carried any logical weight. The strategic necessity was clear and the tactical benefits obvious, but because they represented something that continued to puzzle him about human psychology. In all his years of studying conquered species, Thylex had never encountered a race so consistently willing to prioritize the welfare of their young over tactical advantage. The Keltharians had sacrificed their hatchlings when military necessity demanded it. The Vortek had evacuated only their most genetically valuable offspring, leaving the rest to serve as strategic sacrifices. Even the notoriously emotional Cylindrins had eventually learned to make pragmatic calculations about the survival of their spawn. But humans seemed constitutionally incapable of such logical thinking. Time, and again, they would risk valuable military assets to protect individuals who offered no strategic benefit. They would divert crucial resources to evacuate populations that could not contribute to the war effort for decades. They would even sacrifice advantageous positions to avoid civilian casualties among their enemies. It was a weakness, obviously, a fatal flaw in their tactical thinking that would ultimately ensure their defeat. And yet, as Thylex prepared to implement the final solution to the new harmony problem, he couldn't quite dismiss the nagging thought that there might be something he was failing to understand about the strategic value of such seemingly irrational behavior. "Sir," the communications officer announced, "we're detecting movement from the surface. Multiple small craft attempting to launch from the civilian sectors. Evacuation ships?" "Confirmed, sir. Appear to be carrying non-combatants based on their flight patterns and communications." Thylex moved to his command console, his four hands dancing across the controls as he brought up tactical displays. 7 small ships, barely more than atmospheric shuttles, were struggling to reach orbit while carrying what appeared to be maximum loads. Their trajectories were erratic, suggesting either damage or overloading, and their pilots seemed to be deliberately avoiding the most efficient flight paths. "Curious," he murmured. "They're trying to draw our fire away from the primary evacuation routes." It was tactically sound, if ultimately futile. The smaller ships were sacrificing themselves to create multiple targets, hoping to allow at least some of their charges to escape while the Zephyrian gunners were distracted. It demonstrated the same irrational courage that had made humans such persistent enemies throughout this campaign. "Orders, sir?" his tactical officer inquired. Thylex studied the display for several more seconds, noting the elegant desperation of the human strategy. They knew they couldn't save everyone, but they were determined to save someone, even if it meant certain death for themselves. It was, he had to admit, rather impressively executed for such a hopeless gesture. "Destroy them all," he ordered finally, "but do it efficiently. No need to drag this out." The Sovereign's wrath and its escort vessels opened fire with devastating precision. The evacuation ships, already struggling with damage and overloading, had no chance against military-grade weaponry. One by one, they disappeared in brief flashes of light, their sacrifice achieving nothing beyond a few moments' delay in the inevitable conclusion. As the last evacuation ship was destroyed, Thylex felt a familiar satisfaction at the completion of another successful operation. The strategic objectives had been achieved, Imperial doctrine had been properly implemented, and the humans had received another lesson in the futility of resistance. Soon, his ground forces would complete their sweep of the surface, and New Harmony would join the long list of worlds that had learned the price of defying the Zephyrian Empire. The war would continue, of course, but each victory like this brought them closer to the ultimate goal of human surrender. Yet as Thylex prepared to return his attention to the broader strategic situation, he found himself thinking once more about Colonel Webb's words. The human had spoken of murder, as if the elimination of future threats could be reduced to such a simple moral category. It revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of interstellar conflict, but it also suggested something about human thinking that continued to elude him. Perhaps, he thought as he watched the fires spread across the colony's surface, it would be worth conducting a more detailed analysis of human psychological responses to defeat. Not because their emotional reactions had any strategic value, of course, but because understanding enemy weaknesses was always tactically useful. After all, the Empire's expansion into human space was only beginning. There would be many more colonies like New Harmony, many more choices between tactical efficiency and emotional sentiment. And if there was some aspect of human psychology that could be exploited to make their inevitable surrender come more quickly, then the time spent studying it would be strategically justified. As the Sovereign's wrath prepared to depart the system, leaving only the smoldering remains of what had once been a thriving human colony, Thylex allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at another mission successfully completed. The Empire's expansion continued. Its doctrine remained unchallenged, and another world had learned the ultimate truth about power in the galaxy. Soon, he was certain, the humans would learn that same truth. And when they did, their peculiar attachment to their young would become just another footnote in a long history of Imperial conquest. 3 weeks after the destruction of New Harmony, Commander Thylex Vorn received orders that surprised him. Rather than proceeding with the planned assault on the industrial world of Haven's Gate, his fleet was being diverted to investigate reports of unusual activity in the Arcturus Nebula. The mission briefing had been unusually vague. Intelligence suggested that a human fleet was conducting operations in the region, but the nature of those operations remained unclear. Thylex found the change in orders mildly irritating. The systematic reduction of human military capacity was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the diversion would cost them valuable time. However, Admiral Kestar's strategic planning had never failed the Empire before, and if the Admiral believed this investigation was worth delaying the Haven's Gate operation, then there was undoubtedly good reason. The Sovereign's wrath and its escort fleet entered the Arcturus Nebula's outer edge after 4 days of hyperspace travel. The nebula itself was a sprawling mass of ionized gases and electromagnetic interference that made long-range scanning nearly impossible. It was exactly the sort of environment where a retreating enemy might attempt to establish a hidden base or staging area for guerrilla operations. Initial sensor sweep complete, Commander, reported his science officer, a methodical Zephyrian whose attention to detail had proven invaluable during previous campaigns. Multiple metallic signatures detected throughout the nebula, but the interference is making identification difficult. Recommend close-range reconnaissance. Thylex studied the tactical display, noting the scattered signatures across a region roughly 12 light hours in diameter. If the humans were indeed establishing a base here, they were being unusually thorough about dispersing their assets. Most species, when forced to operate from hidden positions, tended to concentrate their forces for mutual protection and operational efficiency. Deploy reconnaissance drones, he ordered, full spectrum analysis of all metallic signatures, and have the escort vessels spread out in a search pattern. I want to know what the humans are doing here before we announce our presence. The reconnaissance operation took nearly 6 hours to complete, and when the data finally came together, Thylex found himself staring at a tactical situation unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of military service. The metallic signatures weren't concentrated military installations or hidden weapon platforms. They were ships, hundreds of ships of every conceivable design and origin, gathered in loose clusters throughout the nebula. More puzzling still, many of the vessels weren't human at all. His analysis teams had identified Keltharian transport ships, Vortek mining vessels, Cylindran science platforms, and even what appeared to be civilian craft from species he didn't immediately recognize. It was as if someone had gathered a collection of refugee vessels from across the galaxy and hidden them here in the electromagnetic chaos of the nebula. Commander, his intelligence officer announced, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that immediately drew his attention. We've been monitoring communications traffic between the vessels. The transmissions are mostly encrypted, but we've been able to decode enough to determine that this appears to be some sort of rescue operation. Rescue operation? Thylex repeated. Explain. The intelligence officer activated her workstation's main display, showing a 3-dimensional map of the nebula with communication paths traced between the various vessel clusters. The pattern suggests that human ships are coordinating the collection and redistribution of civilian refugees from multiple species. They appear to be gathering survivors from Imperial pacification operations and transporting them to locations outside Imperial space. Thylax studied the display with growing interest. If the analysis was correct, the humans had established a complex logistical operation dedicated entirely to evacuating civilians from conquered worlds. It was an impressive organizational achievement, though strategically baffling. The resources being expended on this operation could have been used to reinforce human military positions or launch counterstrikes against Imperial targets. "How many refugees are we talking about?" he asked. "Conservative estimate based on ship capacities and observed traffic patterns. Approximately 800,000 individuals from 17 different species. The operation appears to have been ongoing for at least 4 months." The numbers were staggering. 800,000 refugees represented not just a massive logistical undertaking, but a significant diversion of human military resources. The ships alone would have cost them dozens of potential combat vessels, to say nothing of the personnel, supplies, and coordination required to maintain such an operation. "Sir," the tactical officer interrupted, "we're detecting movement from one of the human vessels. A single ship is breaking away from the main cluster and heading in our direction." Thylax moved to his command station, bringing up a detailed scan of the approaching vessel. It was a human cruiser of moderate size, showing signs of recent combat damage, but still apparently functional. More importantly, it was making no attempt to mask its approach. Quite the opposite, in fact. The ship was broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies and maintaining a course that would bring it directly into weapon range of the Sovereign's wrath. "They want to talk," he mused. It was either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness, and with humans it could be difficult to tell the difference. "Shall I order the escorts to target the approaching vessel?" his tactical officer inquired. "Not yet. Let's see what they have to say. Open a channel when they reach optimal communication range." The human vessel, which identified itself as the Sanctuary, took another 12 minutes to reach the designated position. When the communication channel finally opened, Thylax found himself facing another human colonel. This one a woman whose uniform bore the insignia of the Terran Federation's Rescue and Recovery Division, a military unit Thylax had never encountered in previous engagements. "I am Colonel Sarah Chun of the TFN Sanctuary," the human began, her voice carrying the same steady confidence he had noted in Colonel Webb weeks earlier. "I'm requesting permission to speak with your commanding officer regarding the civilian populations currently under our protection." "I am Commander Thylax Vorn of the Imperial Navy," he replied. "You are in violation of Imperial space, Colonel. Your vessels will surrender immediately or be destroyed." The human colonel's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she had expected this response. "Commander, before you make any decisions regarding our fate, I'd like you to consider the full scope of what you're dealing with here." She gestured to someone off-screen, and the transmission split to show a tactical display similar to his own. However, this version showed additional details that his reconnaissance drones had missed: the internal composition of many of the refugee ships, the species breakdown of the civilian populations, and, most significantly, the age demographics of the evacuated populations. "What you're looking at, Commander, is the largest refugee evacuation operation in galactic history. 834,000 civilians from 19 different species, all of them survivors of Imperial pacification campaigns. Of those refugees, approximately 40% are juveniles under the age of maturity for their respective species." Thylax studied the displayed information with growing fascination. The humans had indeed managed to evacuate enormous numbers of children from conquered worlds, often apparently during or immediately after Imperial operations. It represented a level of coordination and strategic planning that suggested far more sophisticated intelligence gathering than he had credited them with. "An impressive logistical achievement," he acknowledged. "However, it changes nothing regarding your current situation. These refugees are residents of Imperial territory who have been illegally removed from their designated processing centers." "Processing centers," Colonel Chun repeated, and, for the first time, her professional composure showed signs of strain. "Is that what you call the mass graves?" The accusation was both inflammatory and inaccurate, Thylax reflected. Imperial doctrine called for the efficient elimination of potential threats, but the characterization as mass murder was emotional hyperbole typical of human thinking. Still, he could see the strategic value in addressing her concerns directly. Imperial policy toward conquered populations is designed to ensure long-term stability and security, he explained. The elimination of individuals who might grow to become future threats is a standard military procedure, one that prevents the kind of insurgent conflicts that could drag on for decades. You're talking about children, Commander. Some of them aren't even old enough to walk. I'm talking about future enemy combatants whose elimination now prevents the necessity of more extensive military operations later, Thylex corrected. It is more humane, ultimately, than allowing them to grow up planning vengeance against the Empire. The human colonel was quiet for several moments, her face cycling through expressions that Thylex was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her species when confronted with Imperial logic. Finally, she leaned forward in her chair and spoke with deliberate intensity. Commander, I want to propose something to you. A test, if you will, of your tactical assumptions about the strategic value of eliminating civilian populations. This was unexpected. Continue. You have 800,000 civilians here, representing 19 different species that the Empire has conquered over the past 2 years. According to your doctrine, every one of them represents a potential future threat that should be eliminated for security purposes. She paused, bringing up additional displays that showed detailed biographical information on hundreds of individuals. But here's what I want you to consider. Not one of these refugees has taken up arms against the Empire. Not one of them has joined any resistance movement. Despite watching their homes destroyed and their families killed, they've chosen evacuation over vengeance. Thylex found himself genuinely intrigued by this line of argument. Your point being? My point is that your fundamental assumption about conquered populations may be flawed. You assume that survivors will inevitably become enemies, but our experience suggests that civilians who are treated with basic dignity and allowed to rebuild their lives elsewhere pose no ongoing threat to Imperial security. It was an interesting hypothesis, though one that ran counter to centuries of Imperial experience. Still, Thylex had to admit that the human approach had produced some unexpected results. The refugee populations under their protection had indeed refrained from taking hostile action, despite obvious provocation. Even if your assessment were accurate, Colonel, it fails to address the core issue. These civilians remain under Imperial jurisdiction, and their unauthorized removal represents a violation of sovereign territory. Then, let me make you a different proposal, Colonel Chin said, her voice taking on a new intensity. Allow us to complete our current evacuation operations in exchange for detailed intelligence on human military positions and capabilities. The offer was startling both for its implications and for its apparent sincerity. Thylex studied the human's face carefully, looking for signs of deception or misdirection, but her expression suggested genuine conviction. You would betray your own military forces to protect these refugees. I would provide information that could end this war more quickly and with fewer casualties on both sides, she corrected. The intelligence includes detailed specifications for our new defensive systems, fleet deployment patterns, and production capabilities. Information that would give you a significant strategic advantage in planning future operations. Thylex considered the offer carefully. The intelligence value alone could be substantial, potentially allowing the Empire to conclude the human campaign months ahead of schedule. But there were broader implications to consider as well. Accepting such an arrangement would represent a significant departure from standard Imperial doctrine. Your proposal has merit, he said finally. However, it raises questions about precedent. If the Empire begins negotiating for the return of conquered populations, other species may expect similar arrangements. Commander, Colonel Chun said quietly, how many more colonies like New Harmony will it take to secure human surrender? How many more children will you have to kill to prove that resistance is futile? The question struck Thylex as oddly phrased, focusing on emotional rather than strategic considerations. Yet there was something in the human's tone that suggested she wasn't simply making an emotional appeal. She was pointing towards some tactical calculation that he was missing. The Empire's expansion will continue until human resistance ends, he replied. The timeline depends entirely on your species' willingness to accept the inevitable. But that's exactly my point, Colonel Chin insisted. Every time you destroy a colony, every time you implement your final solutions, you're not just eliminating potential threats, you're creating new ones. Every human who witnesses Imperial pacification operations becomes more determined to resist, not less. Thylex paused, considering this perspective. It was true that human resistance had intensified rather than diminished following recent Imperial victories. He had attributed this to their characteristic irrationality, but perhaps there was a more complex dynamic at work. You're suggesting that imperial doctrine is strategically counterproductive? I'm suggesting that there might be more effective ways to achieve your strategic objectives. Ways that don't require the systematic murder of children. The conversation was taking directions that Thylex found both intellectually stimulating and professionally troubling. The humans' arguments were clearly driven by emotional rather than logical considerations, yet they raised questions about tactical efficiency that deserved serious consideration. Before he could respond, his communications officer announced an incoming priority transmission from Fleet Command. Thylex reluctantly terminated the conversation with Colonel Chun, promising to continue their discussion after reviewing new orders. The transmission from Admiral Kestar was brief and unambiguous. Eliminate all human vessels in the nebula and secure any useful intelligence from their computer systems. The refugee populations were to be returned to Imperial space for proper processing according to standard doctrine. As Thylex reviewed the orders, he found himself thinking about Colonel Chen's proposal. The intelligence she offered could indeed prove strategically valuable, but accepting it would require him to violate direct orders from Fleet Command. More troubling still, he was beginning to suspect that there might be genuine merit to her arguments about the long-term effectiveness of Imperial pacification policies. The tactical situation was clear. His fleet had overwhelming firepower advantage, and the human vessels were trapped within the nebula with no possibility of escape. Standard doctrine called for immediate implementation of Admiral Kestar's orders. Yet something about the entire situation struck him as deserving more careful consideration. Perhaps, Thylex thought, as he prepared to resume communications with the human colonel, it would be worth exploring their proposal in greater detail. Not because their emotional appeals carried any weight, but because the strategic implications of their alternative approach might prove instructive for future operations. After all, the Empire's ultimate goal was not the destruction of conquered populations, but their effective integration into Imperial society. If the humans had developed more efficient methods for achieving that goal, then studying their techniques could prove strategically beneficial. The orders from Admiral Kestar could wait, he decided, for at least a few more hours. Commander Thylex Vorn spent the next 4 hours in what he later recognized as the most intensive strategic analysis session of his career. He had ordered his fleet to maintain position while he conducted a detailed examination of the intelligence Colonel Chun had offered, and what he discovered challenged fundamental assumptions he had held about warfare, conquest, and the nature of Imperial security. The human intelligence package was extraordinarily comprehensive. It included not just military specifications and deployment patterns, but detailed sociological analyses of how different human populations had responded to Imperial conquest. Most significantly, it contained comparative studies of post-conquest stability in regions where different pacification protocols had been implemented. The data was disturbing. According to the human analysis, worlds where Imperial forces had implemented complete population elimination showed a 73% probability of renewed resistance activities within 5 years. The resistance typically came not from the original populations, who had indeed been eliminated, but from neighboring systems whose populations had witnessed the pacification and drawn their own conclusions about Imperial intentions. Conversely, worlds where civilian populations had been relocated rather than eliminated showed only a 12% probability of future resistance, and most of that came from military rather than civilian sources. The humans had apparently been conducting their own extensive study of Imperial pacification methods, and their conclusions suggested that standard doctrine was not only morally questionable, but strategically counterproductive. "Sir," his intelligence officer reported, interrupting his analysis, "we've completed our own assessment of the refugee populations. The demographic breakdown confirms the human data. Approximately 340,000 juveniles from 19 different species, along with roughly 490,000 adults, mostly elderly or injured individuals who were unable to participate in military resistance." Thylex studied the detailed population analysis, noting patterns that had escaped his initial assessment. The refugees weren't just random survivors. They were specifically the most vulnerable members of conquered populations, individuals who posed virtually no conceivable military threat to Imperial security. Yet according to standard doctrine, every one of them was classified as requiring elimination. What's the assessment of their current condition? Medical scans indicate adequate nutrition and healthcare, though clearly under difficult conditions. The humans have established a sophisticated support network that's managing to maintain basic welfare standards for a refugee population of this size. It's actually rather impressive from a logistical standpoint. The admission clearly troubled his intelligence officer, as it troubled Thylex himself. The humans had achieved something that most Imperial strategists would have declared impossible: the successful evacuation and maintenance of nearly 1 million refugees from active war zones. The organizational capability required for such an operation suggested military planning skills that the Empire had consistently underestimated. "Sir," his communications officer announced, "the human colonel is requesting to resume communications. She says she has additional information that might be relevant to your decision." Thylex considered the request. Admiral Kestar's orders were clear, and further delay in implementing them would require increasingly creative explanations. Yet the strategic implications of the intelligence he had reviewed demanded careful consideration. A few more hours of analysis could potentially save the Empire years of unnecessary conflict. "Open the channel," he decided. Colonel Chun appeared on the main screen, her expression showing signs of strain that suggested she was fully aware of the precariousness of her situation. Behind her, Thylex could see increased activity on the bridge of the sanctuary, crew members preparing for what they clearly expected to be a final battle. "Commander," she began without preamble, "I know you've been reviewing our intelligence package. I'm hoping it's given you some insight into why we consider this evacuation operation so strategically important. Your analysis raises interesting questions about the long-term effectiveness of Imperial doctrine," Thylex acknowledged. "However, it fails to address immediate tactical necessities. I have specific orders regarding the disposition of your fleet and the refugee populations under your protection." "Understand. But before you implement those orders, I want to show you something that might change your perspective on what those tactical necessities actually are." The transmission split again, this time showing what appeared to be a medical facility aboard one of the refugee ships. The camera panned across rows of treatment beds occupied by injured individuals from multiple species: Keltharians with damaged exoskeletons, Vorthek with radiation burns, Cylindrins suffering from atmosphere poisoning. "These are survivors from the Kepler-7 operation," Colonel Chin explained. "Your operation, Commander. Children who were injured during the pacification, but managed to survive long enough for our medical teams to extract them." The camera focused on a young Keltharian, its carapace still soft with youth, connected to life support systems that were clearly of human design. Despite the obvious pain, the creature's large compound eyes tracked the camera with alert intelligence. "This is Kethtar," Colonel Chun continued. 7 years old in Keltharian terms, which makes him roughly equivalent to a human 4-year-old. He was found in the ruins of his family's dwelling 3 days after your ground forces completed their sweep. Burns covered 60% of his body, but our medical team was able to stabilize him. Thylex studied the image with professional detachment. The young Keltharian was indeed severely injured, though apparently stable. From a tactical perspective, its survival changed nothing. It would be years before such an individual could pose any threat to Imperial security. "The child's survival is unfortunate," he said finally. "However, it doesn't alter the strategic necessity of preventing future resistance movements." "Commander, look at him," Colonel Chun said, her voice carrying new intensity. "Really look at him. Do you see a future threat to Imperial security? Or do you see a child who's lost everything and just wants to live?" Thylex found himself studying the young Keltharian more carefully. Its eyes held an expression he couldn't quite identify. Not the cold calculation of adult Keltharian intelligence, nor the simple fear he might have expected from an injured juvenile. There was something else there, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the way his own species' young looked when they were seeking comfort from adults. "What I see," he said slowly, "is an individual whose future actions cannot be predicted with certainty. Imperial doctrine assumes the worst-case scenario and plans accordingly. But that's exactly the problem with your doctrine," Colonel Chin pressed. "It assumes that children who survive Imperial conquest will inevitably become enemies. But look at the data we've provided. Look at the actual evidence of how these children develop when they're given the chance to grow up in peaceful circumstances." She brought up additional files, showing long-term tracking data on individuals who had been evacuated from earlier Imperial campaigns. The information was remarkably detailed, following refugees through years of displacement and eventual resettlement in neutral space. This is Velvin, evacuated from the Proxima operation 2 years ago. He's now in vocational training to become an agricultural engineer. This is Cylindra, rescued from the Vega incident. She's studying xenobiology and wants to work in interspecies medical research. This is Vortex, who lost his entire family in the Centauri pacification. He's now training to be a teacher. The profiles continued, showing dozens of individuals who had survived Imperial pacification only to pursue entirely civilian careers in their new homes. Not one of them showed any indication of military training or resistance activity. Your point is noted, Thylex said carefully. However, the sample size is insufficient to draw broader strategic conclusions, and the data itself comes from a potentially biased source. Then, verify it independently, Colonel Chin challenged. Send your own intelligence teams to the neutral systems where these refugees have been resettled. Conduct your own analysis of their activities and intentions. See for yourself whether children who are shown compassion grow up to be enemies or simply people trying to rebuild their lives. It was an intriguing proposal, though one that would require significant resources and time to implement properly. Still, if the human claims proved accurate, the implications for Imperial strategic planning could be substantial. Even if your assessment were correct, Thylex said, it doesn't address the fundamental issue. These refugees are Imperial subjects who have been unlawfully removed from Imperial territory. Their status cannot be changed by emotional appeals or theoretical future behavior. Then, change their status, Colonel Chin said simply. Officially classify them as refugees rather than Imperial subjects. Allow them to resettle in neutral space under formal agreements that guarantee they won't return to Imperial territory or engage in anti-Imperial activities. The suggestion was startling in its simplicity and its implications. Creating formal refugee status for survivors of Imperial conquest would represent a fundamental shift in how the Empire dealt with conquered populations. It would require new treaties, new administrative structures, and, most challenging of all, new strategic doctrines. Such a policy change would need to be approved at the highest levels of Imperial command, Thylex pointed out. It's far beyond my authority to implement. But you could recommend it, Colonel Chin pressed. You could present the strategic analysis to your superiors and let them make an informed decision about whether current doctrine is serving Imperial interests effectively. Before Thylex could respond, his tactical officer announced urgent movement from the refugee fleet. Multiple ships were beginning to disperse throughout the nebula, apparently preparing for evacuation or combat. The organized nature of their movements suggested this was a pre-planned response to perceived threat. Colonel, Thylex said sharply, order your ships to maintain current positions. Any attempt to flee will be considered an act of hostility. They're not fleeing, Commander, Colonel Chin replied, her voice heavy with resignation. They're preparing for the inevitable. My captains know that this conversation was always likely to end in only one way. Thylex studied the tactical display, noting the professional efficiency with which the human ships were positioning themselves. They weren't attempting to escape. The nebula's electromagnetic interference made hyperspace jumps impossible from their current position. Instead, they were spreading out to minimize casualties from Imperial weapons fire and positioning their most defensible ships to protect the refugee transports. They're preparing to fight, his tactical officer observed. Recommend we engage immediately before they can achieve optimal defensive positions. It will be the logical choice. Imperial fleet doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied quickly to prevent enemy forces from organizing effective resistance. The human ships were individually overmatched and collectively outnumbered. A decisive engagement now would conclude the operation within minutes. Yet something about the situation made Thylex hesitate. Perhaps it was the intelligence analysis he had been reviewing, or perhaps it was the strange conversation with Colonel Chan, but he found himself reconsidering the tactical necessities of the situation. Sir, his tactical officer pressed. Orders. Thylex looked at the main screen, where Colonel Chan was watching him with an expression that somehow managed to be both hopeful and resigned. Behind her, he could see her bridge crew preparing for a battle they knew they couldn't win, their faces showing the same peculiar combination of fear and determination that seemed characteristic of human military personnel. Commander, Colonel Chun said quietly, I know you have your orders. I know what Imperial doctrine requires. But I'm asking you to consider whether there might be a better way. Not just for the refugees, not just for my people, but for the Empire itself." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts for what might be her final statement. History will remember what happens here today. The question is whether it will remember an Imperial commander who followed orders without question, or one who had the courage to recognize when those orders might be wrong. The bridge of the Sovereign's wrath had fallen completely silent, every member of Thylex's crew waiting for his decision. In the tactical display, he could see the human ships completing their defensive arrangements, preparing for a battle that would accomplish nothing except the addition of 1,000,000 more names to the casualty lists of an already bloody war. For the first time in his military career, Commander Thylex Vorn found himself questioning not just his orders, but the fundamental assumptions that those orders were based upon. The intelligence data, the refugee profiles, the evident sincerity of the human colonel, all of it pointed toward the possibility that Imperial doctrine might be not just morally questionable but strategically flawed. "Colonel Chun," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of decision that surprised even himself, "I am prepared to consider an alternative arrangement regarding the disposition of the refugee populations. However, such an arrangement would require guarantees that extend far beyond your personal authority." The relief on the human colonel's face was evident, though quickly replaced by professional wariness. "What kind of guarantees?" "Formal treaty arrangements between the Empire and the neutral systems where these refugees would be resettled. Binding agreements that ensure they cannot and will not engage in activities hostile to Imperial interests. And, most importantly, a comprehensive intelligence sharing agreement that provides the Empire with ongoing verification of their compliance." It was, Thylex realized, a proposal that would require him to exceed his authority in ways that could end his career or worse. But the strategic implications of the intelligence he had reviewed suggested that such risks might be justified. "That could be arranged," Colonel Chun said carefully, "though it would take time to negotiate with all the relevant parties." "Time," Thylex mused, "which brings us back to the immediate tactical situation. I have specific orders from Fleet Command regarding the disposition of your vessels and their passengers. Orders that I am currently in violation of by even having this conversation." The admission hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the personal and professional risks that Thylex was accepting by pursuing this unconventional approach. For several long moments, neither spoke, both apparently considering the implications of what was being proposed. Finally, Colonel Chun broke the silence. "Commander, if you're willing to take this risk, to challenge Imperial doctrine in the name of strategic effectiveness, then I think we can find a solution that serves everyone's interests." "Explain." "Stage a different kind of engagement, one that allows you to report mission completion while giving us the time needed to negotiate formal arrangements for the refugees. It would require careful coordination, but it could work." Thylex found himself intrigued despite the obvious complications such a plan would entail. "Continue." "Your orders are to eliminate our fleet and secure the refugees for Imperial processing. But what if the refugees were no longer here when you engaged us? What if they had already been evacuated to neutral space before your attack?" The tactical implications were complex, but potentially workable. If the refugee ships departed before the engagement began, then technically they would no longer be under human protection when Imperial forces attacked. The distinction might be sufficient to satisfy both the letter of his orders and the spirit of the alternative arrangement they were discussing. It would be necessary to ensure that any such evacuation appeared to be the result of Imperial action rather than collaborative planning, Thylex pointed out. "That could be arranged," Colonel Chin agreed, "though it would require precise timing and careful coordination of our respective forces." As Thylex considered the proposal, he realized that he was contemplating the most significant decision of his military career, not just because of its immediate tactical implications, but because of what it represented about the future of Imperial expansion and the nature of conquest itself. If the human intelligence was accurate, if showing compassion to conquer populations was indeed more strategically effective than eliminating them, then the implications extended far beyond this single operation. It would mean that the Empire had been conducting its expansion in ways that were not just morally questionable, but tactically counterproductive. "Colonel," he said slowly, "if we proceed with this arrangement, and if the long-term results prove as beneficial as your analysis suggests, it could fundamentally change how the Empire approaches future conquest operations. That's exactly what we're hoping for, Commander. Not just for this group of refugees, but for all the future civilians who won't have to die for strategic objectives that could be achieved more effectively through different means. It was a compelling vision, though one that would require him to stake his career and possibly his life on the accuracy of human strategic analysis. Yet as Thylex looked at the tactical display, showing nearly 1 million refugees waiting for his decision, he found that the personal risks seemed less important than the possibility of finding a better path forward. Very well, Colonel Chun, he said finally. Let us discuss the specific details of this alternative engagement. The plan that Commander Thylex Vorn and Colonel Sarah Chun developed over the next 6 hours was perhaps the most elaborate deception in the history of interstellar warfare. It required precise timing, careful coordination between enemy fleets, and a level of trust that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Yet as Thylex reviewed the final details, he found himself convinced that it could work. The basic framework was elegantly simple. The refugee ships would begin evacuating through a previously unmapped hyperspace corridor that Chen's people had discovered during their initial survey of the nebula. The evacuation would appear to be a desperate escape attempt triggered by the arrival of Imperial forces. Thylex's fleet would engage the human military vessels while the refugees fled, creating a plausible scenario where the civilians escaped during the confusion of battle. The devil, as humans apparently said, was in the details. The timing has to be perfect, Chen explained during their final coordination session. The refugee ships need a 47-minute head start to clear the nebula's interference zone and enter hyperspace safely. But if we begin evacuation too early, your fleet movements will look suspicious. Too late, and we won't get everyone out before you're required to implement your original orders. Thylex studied the tactical projections on his private display, noting the complex choreography required to make the deception believable. His fleet would need to approach the refugee positions in a standard attack formation, maintaining normal Imperial protocols until the moment the evacuation began. Then, they would need to time their engagement with the human military vessels to provide exactly the right amount of confusion and distraction. My primary concern, he admitted, is the communications traffic. Imperial intelligence monitors all transmissions during fleet operations. If they detect coordination between our forces, the consequences could be severe for both of us. We've developed a solution for that, Chen replied, bringing up technical specifications on our display. Burst transmissions using frequency-agile quantum encryption, disguised as normal combat communications. Your intelligence officers will see what appears to be standard tactical chatter, but will be able to coordinate our movements precisely. The encryption method was sophisticated, clearly the result of extensive human research into Imperial communications protocols. It was also potentially treasonous for Thylex to use it, since it would involve actively deceiving his own intelligence staff. Yet the strategic benefits of the overall operation seemed to justify the risks. What about casualties? He asked. Your ships will need to take damage to make this engagement appear genuine, but we cannot afford to actually destroy vessels carrying civilian refugees. Controlled damage to non-essential systems, Chen explained. My engineering teams have identified specific targets that will create impressive sensor readings without compromising structural integrity or life support. Your gunners will need to be very precise, but it's achievable. They spent another 2 hours reviewing contingency plans and backup procedures, covering everything from unexpected Imperial reinforcements to refugee ships experiencing mechanical failures during evacuation. By the time they concluded their planning session, Thylex felt reasonably confident that the operation could succeed. What he couldn't predict was how his crew would react to the unconventional orders he was about to give them. All stations prepare for engagement, Thylex announced as his fleet moved into final attack positions. Target priority is the human military vessels. Refugee transports are secondary objectives pending completion of the primary mission. It was a subtle but significant departure from standard Imperial doctrine, which typically prioritized the elimination of civilian populations before engaging military targets. His tactical officer noted the deviation, but didn't question it directly. Unusual orders weren't unheard of in complex operations. Sir, his communications officer reported, the refugee ships are beginning to move. It appears they're attempting to evacuate through the nebula's outer edge. Acknowledged. Maintain current approach vector. We'll deal with the refugees after we've eliminated their military escort. Through the view screen, Thylex could see the first wave of refugee ships beginning their carefully choreographed escape. To his crew, it would appear to be a panic flight triggered by the arrival of Imperial forces. In reality, it was the beginning of the most complex rescue operation he had ever participated in. The human military vessels moved into defensive positions with professional efficiency, their formations designed to provide maximum protection for the evacuating transports. Thylex had to admire their tactical skill. Even knowing that this was partially theater, the positioning was sound enough to serve as a genuine defensive strategy if circumstances required it. All vessels, weapons hot, he ordered. Engage enemy military targets on my mark. The first exchange of fire was carefully orchestrated, with Imperial weapons targeting specific systems on human ships, while return fire struck predetermined locations on Zephyrian vessels. To external observers, it would appear to be a fierce engagement between equally matched opponents. In reality, both sides were essentially conducting an elaborate training exercise with live ammunition. Direct hit on the enemy cruiser, his tactical officer reported with satisfaction. Their port weapon arrays are showing significant damage. Thylex nodded approvingly, though he knew that the damage was primarily cosmetic, disabled systems that could be quickly repaired once the engagement concluded. The human ship was still fully functional, though it was now broadcasting convincing distress signals that would support the official report he would need to file. "Sir, the refugee ships are clearing the nebula's outer edge," his sensor operator announced. "Recommend we break off from military engagement and pursue the civilian targets." It was exactly the suggestion that standard doctrine would require, and exactly what Thylex had been hoping to avoid. Negative. Priority remains the elimination of military threats. The refugee ships are already beyond optimal weapon range, and pursuit would expose us to counterattack from the human escort vessels. The reasoning was tactically sound, though it represented a subtle but significant departure from Imperial priorities. His crew accepted the explanation without question, focused as they were on the immediate tactical situation. As the engagement continued, Thylex found himself watching the evacuation progress with growing admiration for the organizational skills the humans had demonstrated. Ship after ship cleared the nebula's interference zone and vanished into hyperspace, carrying their precious cargo of civilian refugees to safety in neutral space. The operation was proceeding with clockwork precision despite the apparent chaos of the ongoing battle. "Enemy vessel sanctuary is showing critical damage," his tactical officer reported. "Recommend we focus fire and finish her." Thylex glanced at his private tactical display, noting that Chen's ship was indeed showing extensive damage readings. But the quantum-encrypted status updates indicated that her crew was safe and her vessel was still combat-capable despite the impressive sensor displays suggesting otherwise. "Maintain current target distribution," he ordered. "I want all enemy vessels disabled, not just the flagship." It was another subtle deviation from standard practice, but one that served the larger strategic purpose of the operation. By spreading damage across the human fleet rather than concentrating on individual targets, he was ensuring that maximum numbers of human personnel would survive the engagement while still creating a convincing appearance of devastating Imperial victory. "Sir," his communications officer announced, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Command. Admiral Kestar is requesting a status update." Thylex felt a cold knot form in his primary stomach. Contact with Fleet Command at this stage of the operation could complicate everything, especially if the Admiral had specific questions about the refugee evacuation. The timing was particularly unfortunate. The last wave of civilian ships was still in the process of escaping, and any change in Imperial tactics now could expose the entire deception. "Put the Admiral through to my ready room," he decided. "Lieutenant Vextar, you have tactical command. Continue current engagement protocols until I return." In the privacy of his ready room, Thylex activated the secure communication channel and found himself facing Admiral Kestar's imposing visage. The Admiral's expression suggested impatience rather than suspicion, which was encouraging but not necessarily reassuring. "Commander Vorn," the Admiral began without preamble, "I trust your operation in the Arcturus Nebula is proceeding according to plan?" "Yes, sir. We located the human refugee operation and are currently engaged with their military escort. The enemy vessels are showing significant damage, and we expect to conclude the engagement within the hour." "Excellent. And the refugee populations?" This was the critical question, the one that could expose everything if Thylex answered incorrectly. The human forces attempted to evacuate them during our initial approach. We are tracking the refugee ships, and will pursue once the military threat has been eliminated. It was technically accurate, though it omitted crucial details about the nature of the evacuation attempt and his decision to prioritize military over civilian targets. Admiral Kestar's expression suggested acceptance of the report, though something in his demeanor indicated that he had additional concerns. Commander, I'm forwarding you updated intelligence regarding human refugee operations. Our analysis suggests that they've been conducting these evacuations on a much larger scale than previously believed. It's possible that your current operation is part of a broader strategic initiative. The intelligence package that appeared on Thylex's display was extensive and troubling. Imperial analysts had apparently been tracking human refugee activities across multiple sectors, and their conclusions suggested that the evacuation efforts were indeed part of a coordinated strategy to preserve civilian populations from conquered worlds. More significantly, the analysis indicated that the refugees weren't simply being hidden in neutral space. They were being actively integrated into new communities where they were contributing to economic and technological development. In effect, the humans weren't just saving lives. They were building a coalition of species with direct experience of imperial conquest and strong motivations to support human resistance efforts. This intelligence changes the strategic parameters of your mission, Commander, Admiral Kestar continued. The refugee populations you're dealing with aren't just potential future threats. They represent an active element of human strategic planning. They must be eliminated completely, along with any intelligence regarding their evacuation procedures. The new orders were unambiguous and directly contradictory to the arrangement Thylex had made with Colonel Chun. If he followed them, nearly 1 million refugees would be hunted down and killed, and the humans would be destroyed before they could implement the alternative approach to post-conquest population management that their intelligence had suggested. Sir, Thylex said carefully, the refugee ships have already scattered beyond our immediate operational area. Locating and eliminating them would require a significant commitment of fleet resources and time. I understand the logistical challenges, Commander. However, the strategic importance of this operation has been elevated to the highest priority levels. You are authorized to requisition additional fleet assets as needed to ensure complete success. Admiral Kestar's image flickered slightly as the transmission encountered interference from the nebula's electromagnetic environment, but his meaning was clear. This was no longer a routine pacification operation. It had become a strategic priority that would be pursued regardless of cost or complexity. Admiral, Thylex said, making a decision that he knew would define the rest of his career. I may have a more efficient approach to achieving these objectives. Explain. The intelligence package the humans compiled includes detailed information about their entire refugee network, evacuation procedures, destination systems, integration protocols, and, most importantly, the identities and locations of all previously evacuated populations. Rather than pursuing the current refugee group and allowing the network to continue operating elsewhere, we could use this intelligence to eliminate the entire operation systematically. It wasn't entirely deception. The human intelligence package did indeed contain that information, though Chun had provided it with entirely different intentions. But if Admiral Kestar accepted this approach, it would buy time for the current refugee group to reach safety while providing Thylex with an opportunity to shape how that intelligence was ultimately used. Admiral Kestar considered the proposal for several long moments, his expression cycling through what Thylex had learned to recognize as intense strategic calculation. Finally, he nodded approvingly. An elegant solution, Commander. Proceed with securing the intelligence and eliminating the immediate human forces. I'll coordinate fleet assets for follow-up operations against the broader refugee network. Understood, sir. I'll forward the intelligence package as soon as we completed our analysis and eliminated any security protocols the humans may have embedded in it. It was a reasonable precaution that would give Thylex several additional hours to work with before Admiral Kestar expected to receive the intelligence. Hours that could be used to coordinate with Colonel Chun on how that intelligence might be modified to serve their mutual objectives rather than imperial doctrine. After Admiral Kestar terminated the communication, Thylex returned to the bridge to find that the engagement with human forces was approaching its planned conclusion. The last wave of refugee ships had successfully escaped into hyperspace, and The human military vessels were showing the extensive damage that would support his operational report. Status of enemy forces? He inquired. All human vessels are heavily damaged, but still operational, his tactical officer reported. They appear to be attempting to withdraw to the nebula's inner edge, probably seeking to use the electromagnetic interference to mask their escape. It was exactly the scenario they had planned, a human retreat that would allow Chen's ships to disappear into the nebula, where they could conduct repairs and coordinate next steps. To his crew, it would appear that the enemy had been defeated, but not completely destroyed, a common outcome in nebula engagements where sensor limitations made precise targeting difficult. Let them go, Thylex decided. Our primary objective was disrupting their refugee operation, and that's been accomplished. Pursuing damaged enemy vessels into heavy interference would be tactically inadvisable. His crew accepted the decision without question, though Thylex could sense their disappointment at not achieving complete destruction of the human forces. However, the strategic intelligence they had recovered would more than compensate for any perceived tactical shortcomings in the engagement. As the Sovereign's Wrath and its escort vessels withdrew from the nebula, Thylex found himself contemplating the broader implications of what had just occurred. Nearly 1 million civilian refugees were now safely en route to neutral space, where they would have the opportunity to rebuild their lives rather than face elimination under Imperial doctrine. The human intelligence package contained information that could potentially revolutionize how the Empire approached post-conquest population management. And, most significantly, he had demonstrated that Imperial commanders could successfully pursue strategic alternatives to standard doctrine when circumstances warranted such innovation. Yet he was also acutely aware that the deception couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Admiral Kestar expected intelligence on a human refugee network, and eventually he would expect to see results from operations based on that intelligence. Sooner or later, Thylex would need to find ways to either satisfy those expectations or face the consequences of his unconventional approach. But for now, nearly 1 million beings who had been condemned to death under Imperial doctrine were alive and free. And in the encrypted communications he was receiving from Colonel Chun, he could see the beginning of something that might ultimately prove more strategically valuable than any military victory. The foundation of a new approach to conquest that achieved imperial objectives without requiring the systematic elimination of entire populations. Whether that foundation would survive the scrutiny of imperial command remained to be seen. But, as Thylex prepared his operational report, carefully documenting a successful engagement that had unfortunately allowed some refugee ships to escape during the confusion of battle, he found himself convinced that the risks had been worth taking. History would indeed remember what had happened in the Arcturus Nebula. The question was whether it would remember it as the beginning of a more humane approach to interstellar conquest, or as the foolish mistake that had cost Commander Thylex Vorn his career and possibly his life. 6 months after the Arcturus Nebula operation, Commander Thylex Vorn stood before the Imperial High Command in circumstances he could never have imagined. Instead of facing court-martial for his unauthorized deviation from standard doctrine, he had been summoned to present his findings on what Admiral Kestar was now calling alternative pacification methodologies. The intervening months had been a complex dance of careful intelligence manipulation, strategic misdirection, and gradual policy influence that had tested every aspect of Thylex's tactical and political skills. The modified intelligence package he had provided about human refugee operations had led to a series of follow-up investigations that, rather than exposing his deception, had instead validated many of the strategic assumptions underlying his arrangement with Colonel Chun. Imperial analysts, working with the carefully curated information Thylex had provided, had conducted their own assessment of post-conquest stability patterns across the Empire. Their conclusions, reached independently of human influence, had been startling. Worlds where civilian populations have been completely eliminated showed significantly higher rates of ongoing resistance activity than worlds where some form of population relocation had occurred. The pattern was consistent across multiple species and conquest scenarios. Systems where Imperial forces had implemented total pacification protocols experienced an average of 2.3 resistance incidents per year for the first 5 years post-conquest, with incident severity actually increasing over time. Systems where civilian populations have been relocated rather than eliminated averaged only 0.4 incidents per year, with severity decreasing as resettled populations established new lives elsewhere. The strategic implications are clear. Admiral Kestar, was explaining to the assembled high command. Current pacification doctrine, while emotionally satisfying and tactically decisive, appears to be strategically counterproductive in many scenarios. Thylex listened from his position at the briefing podium, still somewhat amazed that he was present for this discussion rather than imprisoned for treason. The path that had led him here had been treacherous and uncertain, requiring him to carefully balance his unauthorized cooperation with human forces against his obligations to imperial security. The key had been presenting his alternative approach not as humanitarian sentiment, but as tactical innovation based on empirical analysis. Rather than arguing that killing children was morally wrong, he had demonstrated that allowing them to live was strategically more effective. Instead of appealing to concepts of mercy or compassion, he had focused on efficiency and long-term stability. Commander Vorn, Admiral Kestar, continued, will now present his analysis of the practical implementation challenges associated with large-scale population relocation protocols. Thylex activated his presentation display, showing detailed logistical analyses that had been developed through months of covert coordination with human refugee operations. The data demonstrated not only that civilian evacuation was strategically beneficial, but that it could be accomplished at roughly one-third the cost of traditional elimination protocols. The primary advantage of relocation over elimination, he explained to the assembled command staff, lies in resource efficiency. Traditional pacification requires significant military assets to locate and eliminate dispersed civilian populations. Relocation requires those same populations to concentrate themselves at designated evacuation points, reducing the time and personnel required for effective population management. It was a carefully crafted argument that presented human-style evacuation operations as a more efficient form of imperial conquest rather than an alternative to it. The fact that the evacuated populations were ultimately better off was presented as a beneficial side effect rather than a primary objective. Grand Admiral Zextai, the most senior member of the High Command, leaned forward in her command chair. Commander, your analysis suggests significant strategic benefits from this approach. However, it also requires a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize post-conquest security. Are you convinced that relocated populations pose genuinely reduced threat levels compared to eliminated ones? This was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether his months of careful misdirection had succeeded or failed. Thylex had prepared for it extensively, working with data that Colonel Chun had continued to provide through their ongoing covert communications. Sir, the evidence suggests that properly managed relocation actually creates strategic advantages beyond simple threat reduction, he replied, activating displays that showed economic and technological developments in neutral systems where refugees had been resettled. Relocated populations typically experience what human sociologists call survivor gratitude syndrome. He explained, using terminology that was technically accurate while omitting its human origins. Rather than focusing on vengeance for their losses, they become primarily concerned with rebuilding their lives and ensuring their continued survival. This psychological pattern creates populations that are inherently risk-averse and unlikely to engage in activities that might threaten their newfound security. The data supporting this analysis was extensive and compelling, showing that refugee populations consistently chose economic development over military resistance when given the opportunity. Moreover, their integration into neutral systems had created economic growth that ultimately benefited imperial trade relationships. Furthermore, Thylex continued, relocation protocols create opportunities for ongoing intelligence gathering that are impossible with elimination protocols. Relocated populations maintain cultural and linguistic capabilities that can be valuable for future imperial operations in their regions of origin. It was perhaps the most cynical aspect of his presentation, suggesting that human compassion could be exploited for imperial intelligence gathering. It was also strategically accurate, and it provided a security-focused justification for policies that were fundamentally humanitarian in nature. Grand Admiral Zextai studied the presented data for several minutes before responding. Your analysis is thorough, and your conclusions appear well supported by empirical evidence. However, implementing such protocols would require substantial changes to existing military doctrine and training procedures. Yes, sir. However, the resource savings and strategic benefits appear to justify such investment. Additionally, We have an opportunity to field test these protocols in ongoing operations against human forces, where their own refugee evacuation capabilities could be adapted to serve Imperial objectives. This was the culmination of his months of preparation, presenting cooperation with human refugee operations as a tactical exploitation of enemy capabilities rather than humanitarian collaboration. It was deceptive, but it was also the only way to achieve strategic approval for policies that would save millions of lives. Interesting, Admiral Kestar observed. You're suggesting that we allow human evacuation operations to continue, but redirect them to serve Imperial strategic objectives? Exactly, sir. Rather than expending resources to eliminate refugee populations that pose minimal security threat, we redirect those resources toward eliminating military targets that pose genuine strategic danger. The humans conduct the evacuation operations at their own expense. We maintain detailed intelligence on relocated populations, and we achieve more efficient conquest with reduced resource expenditure. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and compelling in its strategic logic. It also represented a fundamental transformation of Imperial conquest doctrine, though that transformation was being presented as tactical innovation rather than moral revolution. The High Command deliberated for nearly 2 hours before reaching their decision. During that time, Thylex found himself thinking about the nearly 1,000,000 refugees whose lives had hung in the balance of this discussion. If his presentation failed to convince Imperial leadership, those individuals, along with countless millions more in future operations, would face the traditional fate of conquered populations. When Grand Admiral Zextai finally called for his attention, her expression was carefully neutral. Commander Vorn, the High Command has reviewed your analysis and recommendations. We are prepared to authorize limited implementation of alternative pacification protocols in designated test sectors. Thylex felt a complex mixture of relief and trepidation. Limited implementation was far from complete policy change, but it represented an unprecedented shift in Imperial thinking about post-conquest population management. However, the Grand Admiral continued, such implementation will require careful oversight and evaluation. You are hereby assigned to develop detailed operational protocols for what we will designation efficient population management initiatives. You will also coordinate with designated human contact points to ensure that their evacuation capabilities are properly directed toward Imperial strategic objectives. The authorization to maintain coordination with designated human contact points was perhaps the most significant element of the decision. It provided official cover for his ongoing communication with Colonel Chun and other human refugee coordinators, allowing what had been treasonous collaboration to become legitimate Imperial policy. Over the following months, the efficient population management protocols were implemented in 3 test sectors where Imperial forces were conducting conquest operations against human and allied worlds. The results exceeded even Thylex's optimistic projections. Civilian evacuation proceeded smoothly under Imperial supervision. Post-conquest resistance dropped to historically low levels, and resource expenditure for pacification operations decreased by an average of 37%. More importantly, nearly 4 million civilians who would have been eliminated under traditional doctrine were successfully relocated to neutral systems, where they began rebuilding their lives. The refugee populations, rather than becoming sources of ongoing resistance, became economic contributors to their new communities and, as Thylex had predicted, sources of valuable intelligence about their regions of origin. The success of the test programs led to gradual expansion of the new protocols across other Imperial sectors. Within 2 years, efficient population management had become standard doctrine for most Imperial conquest operations, fundamentally changing the nature of the Empire's expansion. The transformation wasn't without complications. Some Imperial commanders resisted the new protocols, viewing them as unnecessarily complex compared to traditional elimination procedures. Coordination with human refugee operations required delicate negotiations that sometimes broke down over disputes about evacuation priorities or settlement locations. And the intelligence value of relocated populations, while genuine, proved less significant than Thylex had originally suggested to justify the policy changes. Yet the overall strategic benefits were undeniable. Imperial expansion continued at an accelerated pace, post-conquest stability improved dramatically, and the Empire's relationships with neutral systems became increasingly cooperative as those systems witnessed Imperial willingness to support civilian welfare rather than simply eliminate potential threats. Perhaps most significantly, the policy changes had begun affecting how Imperial forces approached conquest operations in general. When elimination of civilian populations was no longer standard procedure, commanders found themselves developing more sophisticated approaches to achieving strategic objectives. Rather than simply destroying everything that might pose a future threat, they began distinguishing between genuine security concerns and manageable civilian populations. 3 years after the Arcturus Nebula operation, Commander Thylex Vorn, now Admiral Thylex Vorn, received a private communication from Colonel Sarah Chun, who had been promoted to general and placed in charge of Terran Federation refugee coordination activities. "Admiral," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that the Keltharian child you saw in our medical facility during our first negotiations, Kethtar, recently graduated from technical school with honors in engineering. He's designing agricultural systems for a mixed-species colony in neutral space. His adoptive family tells me he wants to become an architect someday, to build homes that can't be destroyed by war." The message continued with updates on dozens of other refugees whose lives have been saved by their collaboration. Children who are now studying, working, creating families, and contributing to their new communities. Adults who had overcome trauma to become teachers, artists, engineers, and leaders in the growing network of peaceful settlements that had emerged from the tragedy of conquest. But more than individual success stories, Chun concluded, "I wanted to thank you for something larger. The policy changes you championed haven't just saved lives. They've begun changing how the galaxy thinks about conflict itself. Other species are starting to adopt similar approaches in their own disputes. The Vortex Confederation recently established refugee protection protocols based on Imperial EPM guidelines. The Keltharian Assembly is negotiating relocation agreements for populations in contested systems rather than simply eliminating them." It was true, though Thylex suspected that Chun was being modest about humanity's role in encouraging these developments. Human diplomatic efforts had been instrumental in spreading the new approaches to conflict resolution, though they had carefully presented them as imperial innovations rather than human moral imperatives. The communication concluded with intelligence that both pleased and troubled Thylex. "Our analysis suggests that within a generation, maybe 2, the practice of eliminating civilian populations during conquest operations may become so rare as to be considered a historical curiosity. Children growing up in the current environment simply won't accept mass murder as a normal part of interstellar politics." The implications were staggering. If Chen's assessment proved accurate, then their collaboration had accomplished something far more significant than saving individual lives. It had fundamentally altered the trajectory of galactic civilization itself. Yet, even as he contemplated these broader implications, Thylex found his thoughts returning to the specific individuals whose lives had been changed by their decisions. The young Keltharian who wanted to become an architect. The thousands of other children who were now growing up in safety rather than facing elimination for the crime of being born into the wrong circumstances. In his official reports, Admiral Thylex Vorn continued to present efficient population management as a tactical innovation designed to serve Imperial strategic objectives. The protocols were described in terms of resource efficiency, intelligence gathering, and post-conquest stability rather than humanitarian concern. It was a necessary fiction that allowed the Empire to embrace compassionate policies without acknowledging them as such. But, in his private moments, looking out at the stars from his flagship's observation deck, Thylex allowed himself to acknowledge the deeper truth about what they had accomplished. They had proven that mercy was not weakness, that compassion was not incompatible with strength, and that the most powerful military forces in the galaxy could choose to preserve life rather than destroy it. The transformation wasn't complete, and it might never be complete. There would always be commanders who preferred the simplicity of elimination over the complexity of relocation, politicians who saw compassion as strategic vulnerability, and situations where genuine security concerns might require difficult choices. But the fundamental assumption that conquest required mass murder had been successfully challenged and largely discredited. As Admiral Thylex Vorn prepared for his next assignment, overseeing the implementation of EPM protocols in the challenging Outer Rim sectors, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this point. He had begun as a loyal Imperial commander, implementing standard doctrine without question. He had become, almost despite himself, an architect of the most significant transformation in military ethics in galactic history. The irony wasn't lost on him that this transformation had been achieved not through moral appeals or humanitarian arguments, but through cold strategic analysis and tactical innovation. By presenting compassion as efficiency and mercy as strategic advantage, they had made kindness acceptable to an empire built on conquest. Perhaps that was humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. Not their military technology or their tactical innovations, but their stubborn insistence on finding ways to be decent even in the midst of terrible circumstances. They had taken imperial logic and used it to justify imperial compassion, turning the Empire's own strategic thinking against its most brutal impulses. Standing on the bridge of his flagship as it prepared to enter hyperspace for the Outer Rim, Admiral Thylex Vorn thought about the children who were alive today because of a conversation that had begun with a simple question. Did eliminating potential future threats actually serve Imperial security interests better than finding ways to remove those threats without destroying the people who might someday pose them? The answer, it turned out, had been no. And that answer had changed everything. Behind them, across dozens of systems, millions of refugees were building new lives in circumstances that would have been impossible under traditional Imperial doctrine. Children were growing up who would remember the Empire not as destroyers of worlds, but as the force that had given them the chance to live and grow in peace. Ahead of them lay the Outer Rim sectors, where new conquest operations were planned and where EPM protocols would face their most challenging tests yet. But Admiral Thylex Vorn was confident that the principles they had established would prove as effective there as they had elsewhere. After all, the fundamental insight that had started everything remained as valid as ever. Showing mercy to conquer populations wasn't just morally superior to eliminating them. It was strategically more effective. And in a galaxy where strategic effectiveness was the ultimate measure of success, that insight was powerful enough to transform not just individual operations, but entire civilizations. As the stars elongated into hyperspace transit lines, Admiral Thylex Vorn allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning was enough to change the course of history. The young Keltharian who wanted to become an architect would have his chance to build homes that couldn't be destroyed by war. And in a galaxy slowly learning that conquest didn't require mass murder, perhaps someday war itself would become as obsolete as the doctrine of total civilian elimination had become. It was Admiral Thylex Vorn reflected as his fleet jumped toward the Outer Rim, a future worth fighting for. Not with weapons of destruction, but with the far more powerful tools of strategic wisdom and compassionate innovation.